There is a particular kind of prayer most people never learn. Not the formal prayers of liturgy or devotion, not the desperate prayers of crisis when words come easily because need is overwhelming, but the quiet, daily, almost mundane prayer that happens at the end of an ordinary day, when nothing dramatic occurred, when you neither soared to spiritual heights nor fell into obvious sin, when life was simply life and you are simply tired. This is the prayer most people skip. Because what is there to say? The day was ordinary. Nothing happened that seems worth bringing before God. You were not particularly holy. You were not particularly sinful. You simply lived through another day that looked much like yesterday and will probably look much like tomorrow. But Saint Thérèse of Lisieux understood something about these ordinary evenings that most people miss entirely. They are not interlude between the important moments. They are the substance of your actual life. And if you cannot learn to bring the ordinary before God, if you can only pray when something dramatic happens or when you feel particularly moved, then you will spend most of your life never really praying at all. Let me ask you something gently. When you lie down at night, do you speak to God? Not recite memorized prayers, though those have their place, but actually speak. Tell Him about your day. Acknowledge what you noticed, what you failed at, what you need, what you are grateful for. Or do you simply review your day silently, judge yourself privately, make mental notes about what you should do differently tomorrow, and then fall asleep without ever actually addressing the one who was present to every moment you just lived through? Most people do the latter. They treat God like a distant observer rather than an intimate companion. They assume He only wants to hear from them when they have something spiritually impressive to report or when they need something urgently. They forget that relationship is built not in dramatic moments, but in consistent, small, daily communication. The kind of communication that happens naturally between people who actually know each other. Thérèse knew this, and she developed a practice of evening prayer that was not elaborate or time-consuming, but was profoundly relational. She would bring 5 small things before God every night, not because the number 5 was magical, but because these 5 things captured the essence of what the soul needs to acknowledge before resting, the acknowledgements that keep the relationship real, honest, intimate, and continually renewed. These 5 things are not complex. They require no theological expertise, no spiritual maturity beyond basic honesty, but they are revolutionary in their simplicity, because they transform the end of your day from a private review session where you are both prosecutor and defendant, to a conversation with someone who already knows everything about your day and loves you anyway. This is the practice Thérèse lived by, and it is the practice that can transform your relationship with God from something formal and distant to something as natural and necessary as breathing. But only if you actually do it. Only if you make space, every night, to tell God these 5 small things that He is waiting to hear, not because He needs the information, but because you need to give it to someone who will receive it with perfect understanding and perfect love. The first thing Thérèse would tell God every night was the simplest and yet, for many people, the hardest, where she failed that day. Not in elaborate confession, not with extended self-accusation or dramatic remorse, just honest, brief acknowledgement. I was impatient here, I was selfish there. I chose comfort over charity in this moment. I missed this opportunity to love. Have you ever noticed how reluctant most people are to do this? How we would rather review our day highlighting what went well, minimizing what went poorly, explaining away our failures as understandable given the circumstances. How we negotiate with ourselves, softening our own rough edges, finding justifications for why we acted as we did. This reluctance is not about avoiding God's judgment. Most devout people know intellectually that God forgives. The reluctance is about maintaining a self-image, about not wanting to admit, even to ourselves, how far we still are from the person we imagine we should be, about protecting the illusion that we are making steady spiritual progress when the reality is that we keep falling in the same places, struggling with the same weaknesses, needing mercy just as desperately today as we did years ago. But Thérèse understood that this protective instinct, this desire to present a better version of yourself even in private prayer, is actually what prevents intimacy with God. Because intimacy requires honesty. It requires being known as you actually are, not as you wish you were. And as long as you are managing your image before God, editing your presentation, hiding your failures behind explanations, you are relating to Him as a judge you are trying to impress, rather than as a father who already knows and loves you completely. So she made it her practice to tell him immediately, simply, without drama, "Here is where I failed today," not to wallow in it, not to perform elaborate penance. Just to acknowledge it, bring it into the light, and let Him deal with it rather than carrying it into sleep where it would fester into either shame or rationalization. Let me ask you honestly, when was the last time you told God about a specific failure without qualifying it, without explaining it away, without immediately pivoting to how you will do better tomorrow? When did you simply say, "I was wrong here, I was selfish here, I failed to love here," and then stop talking and let Him respond with mercy, rather than rushing to defend yourself or promise improvement? This acknowledgement is not self-flagellation. It is honesty. And honesty is the foundation of every real relationship. Without it, your evening prayer becomes performance. With it, your evening prayer becomes communion. The second thing Thérèse would tell God was what she noticed that day. The small beauties, the unexpected graces, the moments that caught her attention and revealed something about how He was present, even when she did not feel Him. A sunrise, a kindness from another sister, a moment of clarity in prayer, the way light fell through a window, the feeling of peace that settled over her during a difficult task. This practice sounds simple, but it is actually radical, because it trains the soul to see, to pay attention, to recognize God's fingerprints on ordinary moments that most people rush past without noticing. Have you ever realized how much of your day you live on autopilot? How you can go from morning to night without actually seeing anything, without noticing the sky, the faces around you, the small mercies that punctuate even difficult days, without recognizing that God is not absent during ordinary moments but hidden within them, waiting to be noticed by someone paying attention. Thérèse believed that God reveals Himself constantly in small things, not usually in dramatic interventions or obvious miracles, but in the texture of ordinary life, in beauty, in kindness, in the thousand small graces that we only see if we are looking for them. And telling God what you noticed is not just reporting back to Him what He already knows. It is training yourself to see, because when you know that at the end of the day you will tell God what you noticed, you start paying attention during the day. You start looking for His presence in the ordinary, rather than waiting for something extraordinary to convince you He is real. Let me ask you something. What did you notice today? Not what happened to you, but what you actually saw. What caught your attention? What made you pause even briefly? If you cannot answer, it is not because nothing was there to notice. It is because you were not looking. This is why Thérèse made this part of her evening prayer, not to perform gratitude, but to cultivate awareness, to train her soul to see God where He actually is, in the small, the ordinary, the easily overlooked, rather than only in the dramatic moments that require no faith to recognize. And the beautiful thing is this: the more you practice telling God what you noticed, the more you notice. The practice itself opens your eyes, until gradually, imperceptibly, your entire relationship with the world changes. You stop sleepwalking through your days and start actually living them. You stop waiting for God to show up in extraordinary ways and start recognizing Him in the ordinary ways He has been showing up all along. The third thing Thérèse would tell God was where she felt Him that day. Not where she should have felt Him according to theology, not where she hoped to feel Him, but where she actually genuinely experienced His presence, even if it was in unexpected places, even if it was not in prayer or during Mass, even if it was in moments that do not seem particularly spiritual at all. This practice requires a different kind of honesty than the first. The first requires admitting failure. This requires admitting feeling. And for many people, especially those trained in a spirituality that emphasizes duty over emotion, admitting feeling is harder than admitting failure. Have you ever noticed how reluctant some Christians are to talk about actually experiencing God? How they are more comfortable discussing doctrine than describing encounter? How they can articulate sophisticated theology about God's presence, but struggle to name a single moment when they felt Him close? This reluctance comes from different places. Sometimes it is fear, fear that if you claim to feel God's presence, you are being presumptuous, emotional, or insufficiently rational. Sometimes it is disappointment. You have spent so long not feeling Him that admitting the occasional moment when you do feels like betraying all the moments when you do not. Sometimes it is simply unfamiliarity. You have been taught to trust doctrine more than experience, to believe God is present even when you feel nothing, and so you have trained yourself not to pay attention to feeling at all. But Thérèse understood that God desires to be felt, not just believed. He desires relationship, not just intellectual assent. And while feeling is not the measure of His presence, He is present even when you feel nothing. The moments when you do feel Him are gifts. They are meant to be noticed, received, acknowledged with gratitude. So she would tell him, "I felt you today when this person showed me unexpected kindness. I felt you in the peace that came during silent prayer. I felt you in the tears that finally came after weeks of dryness. I felt you in the moment I forgave and the weight lifted. I felt you. Let me ask you, where did you feel God today? Not where you know He was theologically, but where you experienced Him emotionally, spiritually in the depth of your soul. If you cannot answer, is it because He was absent, or because you have trained yourself not to notice feeling, not to trust experience, not to acknowledge the moments of genuine encounter, because they seem too subjective, too uncertain, too easily dismissed as emotion? This practice of telling God where you felt Him does something crucial. It teaches you to recognize and value the ways He actually relates to you, rather than only the ways you think He should. It honors the uniqueness of your relationship with Him. It makes space for the reality that God relates to each soul differently, and the way He touches your heart might not match what you read in spiritual classics, but is no less real, no less Him, no less a gift to be received with gratitude. And here is the paradox. When you start telling God where you felt Him, you start feeling Him more. Not because the practice manipulates emotion, but because paying attention to His presence makes you more sensitive to it. Until gradually what was rare becomes more frequent, what was uncertain becomes more recognizable, what was easily dismissed becomes undeniable. The fourth thing Thérèse would tell God was what she needed from Him tomorrow. Not in the abstract, not the general prayer for grace and strength that could apply to any day, but the specific help she knew she would need for the specific challenges she could already see coming. Tomorrow, she would encounter the sister who irritated her. She needed patience. Tomorrow, she would face the task that felt overwhelming. She needed strength. Tomorrow, she would pray through dryness again. She needed perseverance. Tomorrow, she would be tempted to self-pity. She needed perspective. This practice is not about manipulating God or treating Him like a spiritual vending machine. It is about honesty regarding your own poverty. It is about admitting, I cannot do tomorrow on my own. I know where I will fail without help. I know what I need, and I cannot generate it myself. So I am asking now, before the need becomes crisis, while I still have the clarity to see what is coming, and the humility to admit I cannot handle it alone. Have you ever done this? Actually told God the specific help you will need tomorrow? Or do you wait until you are in the middle of failure to cry out for help? Do you try to handle tomorrow on your own strength and then wonder why you fell in the same places you always fall? Thérèse understood that asking for help beforehand is not lack of faith. It is wisdom. It is recognizing your limits. It is relating to God as a child relates to a father, not pretending to be self-sufficient, not waiting until you are drowning to call for help, but saying in advance, tomorrow will be hard in these specific ways. I will need you in these specific places. Please give me what I cannot give myself. Let me ask you, what do you need from God tomorrow, not what you might need? What you know you will need based on what you know about yourself, about your weaknesses, about the specific situations you will face. If you cannot answer, is it because you genuinely do not know, or because you have not actually thought about it, have not examined your day tomorrow with enough honesty to recognize where you will struggle without help? This practice of asking specifically does something crucial. It makes you pay attention during tomorrow to whether God provides what you asked. For it makes your prayer measurable in a way that general requests are not. You asked for patience with a specific person. Did you receive it? You asked for strength for a specific task. Did it come? You asked for perseverance through dryness. Were you given it? And when you start paying attention to how God answers these specific requests, your faith stops being abstract and becomes experiential. You stop believing in a God who might help in theory and start trusting a God who does help in practice. You accumulate evidence, not for skeptics, but for yourself, that He actually hears, actually responds, actually provides what you need when you need it. The fifth thing Thérèse would tell God every night was the simplest and yet in some ways the most profound, that she loved Him. Not because of what He did for her that day, not in exchange for answered prayers or felt presence. Just I love you despite everything, despite my failures, despite the dryness, despite the fact that I do not feel close to you right now. I love you. This declaration sounds obvious, but for most people, it is not. Most people only tell God they love Him when they feel it, when prayer is warm, when He feels close, when their spiritual life is going well. But Thérèse understood that love declared in dryness is purer than love declared in consolation. That telling God you love Him when you feel nothing is more meaningful than telling Him when you feel everything. Have you ever noticed how your expressions of love to God fluctuate with your emotional state? How easily you tell Him you love Him when prayer is sweet, and how rarely you say it when prayer is dry. How your declarations of love become indirect, expressed through service or duty or persistence, rather than simple and direct when you do not feel the warmth behind them. This reluctance is understandable. It feels dishonest to say, I love you, when you do not feel it. It feels like lying, like performing emotion you do not possess, like trying to manipulate God or yourself into feeling what is not there. But Thérèse understood something deeper. Love is not primarily a feeling. It is a decision, a commitment, a stance of the will that persists, regardless of emotional weather. And telling God you love Him when you feel nothing is not lying. It is telling the deepest truth. It is saying, my feelings fluctuate, but my commitment does not. I choose you, even when I do not feel you. I remain yours even when you feel absent. I love you not because of what you give me, but because of who you are. Let me ask you, when was the last time you told God you loved Him when you felt nothing? When was the last time you made that declaration, not as the climax of a beautiful prayer, but as the anchor of a difficult day? When was the last time you said it simply because it is true, not emotionally true in that moment, but essentially true about who you have chosen to be and whom you have chosen to belong to? This practice of declaring love, regardless of feeling, does something crucial. It makes your relationship with God more stable, because relationships built on feeling are fragile. When the feeling goes, the relationship shakes. But relationships built on commitment, where love is declared and renewed regardless of emotional weather, can weather anything. Thérèse's spiritual life was not an endless succession of consolations. She experienced profound dryness, devastating darkness, long periods where God felt utterly absent. But through all of it, she continued to tell Him she loved Him. Not because she felt it in those moments, but because she had decided it was true regardless of what she felt. And this daily practice of declaring love, of ending every day by telling God, I love you, whether it felt emotionally authentic or not, created a foundation that could not be shaken. When consolation came, it was received with gratitude. When dryness came, it was endured with trust. But the relationship remained constant because it was built not on the shifting sand of emotion, but on the rock of committed, declared, daily renewed love. These are the 5 small things Thérèse would tell God every night. Not because God needs to hear them, but because you need to say them, because saying them trains you to live differently during the day, because bringing them before God every evening creates a rhythm of honesty, awareness, trust, and love that gradually transforms not just your prayer, but your entire relationship with Him. But here is what most people miss about this practice. It is not a formula, it is not a technique to master or a checklist to complete, so you can feel like you prayed properly. It is a conversation, and conversations are not mechanical. They are alive. They adapt. They flow differently each night depending on what the day brought and what your heart needs to say. Some nights, telling God where you failed will take 30 seconds. Other nights, it will require longer, not because you committed some dramatic sin, but because you need to sit with the reality of your weakness, to let Him see it fully, to stop defending yourself, and simply rest in being known as you are. Some nights, telling Him what you noticed will be a quick list of small graces. Other nights, one single moment will be so luminous, so clearly His presence, that you will want to sit with it longer, to let gratitude deepen, to thank Him not just with words, but with silence that says more than words could hold. The practice is a structure, yes, but structures are not prisons, they are trellises, something for the living thing to grow on, to give it shape without constraining its life. These 5 things provide the shape. What you bring within that shape each night is yours, uniquely yours, unrepeatable. The specific content of your specific day with your specific God, who relates to you in ways that are not generic, but particular to who He made you to be. Let me ask you one final question. What would change in your life if you actually did this? If every night before sleep you took 5 minutes to tell God these 5 things: where you failed, what you noticed, where you felt Him, what you need tomorrow, and that you love Him. What would change is this. Gradually, imperceptibly, your relationship with God would stop being formal and become intimate. It would stop being occasional and become constant. It would stop being based on what you think you should feel and become based on what you actually experience. It would stop being about performing spirituality and start being about knowing and being known by the one who has been present to every moment of your day, every failure, every grace, every beauty you noticed or missed, every need you have for tomorrow, and who is waiting every evening not for a perfect account of a holy day, but for an honest conversation with the soul He loves. But there is something else that would change, something even more fundamental. You would begin to live your days differently, not dramatically, not all at once, but subtly, steadily, in ways you only notice looking back. When you know you will tell God at the end of the day where you failed, you become more aware during the day of when you are failing. Not in a paralyzing, scrupulous way, but in a way that creates small pauses, small moments where you recognize, this is the place. This is where I am choosing myself over love. This is where I need to do differently. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, that awareness in the moment is enough to help you choose differently. When you know you will tell God what you noticed, you start looking for things to notice. You start paying attention to the world He made, to the people He put in your path, to the small mercies that punctuate even difficult days. Your eyes open. Your heart becomes more receptive. And gradually, imperceptibly, you stop sleepwalking through your life and start actually living it. When you know you will tell God where you felt Him, you start paying attention to feeling, not creating it artificially, not manufacturing spiritual emotion, but noticing the moments, often unexpected, often in places that do not seem particularly spiritual, where something shifts in your chest, where peace settles, where you sense His presence in a way that is subtle but unmistakable. And in noticing these moments, you become more sensitive to them. What was rare becomes more frequent. What was easily dismissed becomes undeniable. When you know you will tell God what you need tomorrow, you start thinking about tomorrow with more honesty and less bravado. You stop pretending you can handle everything on your own. You start recognizing your patterns, your weak points, the places where you always struggle. And in recognizing them, you start asking for help before you fall rather than after. You start living in dependence rather than independence. You start relating to God as a child who needs help rather than an adult who occasionally requires assistance. When you know you will tell God you love Him, you start thinking about whether you mean it, not in a scrupulous way, but in a way that makes you examine. Am I living like someone who loves Him? Are my choices reflecting love or something else? And when you do fail to love, when you choose yourself over Him, comfort over sacrifice, ease over charity, the evening declaration of love becomes not hypocrisy but honesty. I love you, but I loved you poorly today. I love you, but I let that love be weak today. I love you and I want to love you better tomorrow. This is what the practice does. It creates a rhythm, a daily returning, a constant realignment between who you are and who you are becoming. It makes prayer not a special activity you do at certain times, but the interpretive lens through which you understand your entire life. And here is the final gift of this practice. It makes sleep different. Most people go to sleep with their minds racing, reviewing failures with anxiety, planning tomorrow with stress, carrying the weight of the day into rest without ever putting it down. But when you bring the day before God, when you tell Him these 5 small things and then simply rest in having been heard, the weight lifts. Not because the failures disappear, not because tomorrow's challenges cease to exist, but because they have been acknowledged to someone who can actually do something about them. Someone who receives your failures with mercy, your noticings with delight, your feelings with understanding, your needs with provision, your love with His own love that makes yours possible in the first place. And in that acknowledgement, in that release, you can finally rest. Not the fitful rest of someone still carrying everything, but the deep rest of someone who has handed the day to God, all of it, the good and the bad, the noticed and the missed, the felt and the unfelt, and trusted Him to hold it while you sleep. This is what Thérèse discovered. This is what she practiced. And this is what she invites you to discover, that the ordinary evening, the quiet moment before sleep, the simple daily practice of telling God these 5 small things, is not a minor addition to your spiritual life, but the very heart of it. The place where relationship is built, the place where love is declared, the place where the soul finally stops performing and starts being real before the one who desires reality more than any religious facade could ever impress him. The day is ending. God is waiting. Not for eloquence, not for spiritual maturity, not for a perfect account of holy achievements, just for you, as you are. With your failures and your small noticings and your uncertain feelings and your specific needs and your love, however faint it feels in this moment, He is waiting for these 5 small things, and He will still be waiting tomorrow night, and the night after, and every night for the rest of your life. The only question is whether you will finally tell Him. Tonight, before you sleep, try it. Just once. 5 small things. 5 honest acknowledgements. 5 minutes of conversation with the one who was present to every moment of your day and is present now, listening, receiving, loving you exactly as you are. Tell Him where you failed. Tell Him what you noticed. Tell Him where you felt Him. Tell Him what you need tomorrow. Tell Him you love Him. And then rest, in having been heard, in being known, in being loved. This is the practice. This is the invitation. This is what Thérèse lived by, and what transformed her ordinary days into a life of profound intimacy with God. It is waiting for you, too, tonight and every night. These 5 small things that God is waiting to hear.